Ethan, a lonely 15-year-old teenager, feels abandoned after his parents' divorce. His mother, Sarah, is too caught up in her new relationship to notice his growing anger. Obsessed with dark movies and violent games, Ethan begins to plan his way to make her finally see him. One night, Ethan sets a trap in their house, hoping for revenge. But when his younger sister, Lily, comes home early, he hesitates, realizing the horror of what he's about to do. The police arrive, and Ethan is arrested. His plan falls apart, and he has to face the consequences of his dark thoughts. Ethan awoke to a sudden sound that shattered the still, oppressive silence of the night. His mind, just moments ago immersed in deep sleep, struggled to grasp what was happening. The room he was in was shrouded in semi-darkness, only thin slivers of moonlight pierced through the heavy, long unwashed curtains, faintly illuminating the space around him. In the dim light, the outlines of books scattered haphazardly on the floor. A pile of clothes, and other items forgotten in the chaos of daily life could be made out. Ethan groggily rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep and regain his ability to think clearly. The sound had seemed too loud, too sharp for the quiet, nearly lifeless night. He listened intently, trying to catch it again. The noise came from downstairs as if someone had suddenly and carelessly closed a door, although, at this late hour, such an occurrence seemed unlikely. The clock on the bedside table, old and with a barely noticeable crack in the glass, showed 2:13 a.m. A time when every noise seems louder, and every sound more threatening. With a heavy sigh that almost blended into the darkness of the night, Ethan slowly rose from the bed. The mattress beneath him creaked, breaking the fragile silence that had returned after the initial mysterious sound. Ethan approached the window, carefully avoiding the books strewn across the floor. His movements were cautious, as if he were afraid of waking someone or something that might be hiding in the shadows. He carefully pulled aside the curtain, made of a thick fabric that had once been a bright blue but had since faded to a dull gray. Through the murky glass, he looked outside, where the world lay hidden in the depths of night. Down below, on the driveway, stood his mother, Catherine, motionless. Her figure was outlined against the dim glow of the streetlight. She was dressed in an evening gown, glittering and perhaps too fancy for such a late hour. Beside her stood a man, unfamiliar to Ethan. Tall and fit, with short, almost military-style hair. His figure was outlined by the streetlight, but his face remained in shadow, hidden from prying eyes. Ethan squinted, trying to make out his features, but it was in vain. The light only slightly illuminated his profile, making him even more mysterious and inaccessible. Catherine and the man stood close, their faces almost touching, and the words they whispered were barely discernible in the stillness of the night. Their voices seemed to be carried away by the wind, with only faint snippets of phrases reaching Ethan's ears. And then, amidst the night's silence, their conversation was suddenly interrupted by loud laughter. This laugh sounded almost defiant, as if they were unafraid of the time of night or the possibility of being seen. This laughter sliced through the night's silence like a knife, echoing in the quiet of Ethan's room. He continued to watch them, his gaze cold and his expression indifferent, like stone. He didn't need to hear their words to understand what they were discussing. Everything was already crystal clear. His mother was too engrossed in this stranger to notice her son standing by the window. Her attention was entirely focused on this new person in her life, and she didn't care that she was being watched. Ethan felt an unpleasant sensation growing in his chest. It was hard to distinguish, like a mix of resentment and anger, emotions he had long grown accustomed to. It was more than just disappointment, but that, too, had become a part of his life. He was used to his mother coming home at such late hours. But this man, he was new. Another stranger, just like those before him, and likely like those who would come after him. For Catherine, her dates and personal life seemed far more important than her children. She didn't spend time pondering how her actions might affect her son and daughter. Ethan had long realized this, but the knowledge brought him no relief. Her attention was always directed elsewhere, toward someone else. Ethan's father had left a few months ago, leaving a void in his life that no one seemed able to fill. But for Catherine, that void had quickly been filled by a new man. Too quickly for it not to leave Ethan with a bitter sense of betrayal. He let go of the curtain, allowing it to fall back into place, and leaned against the cold wall, covered in cracks and stained with old paint. But even as he shut the window to the outside world, he could still hear their conversation, echoing in his head. Through the thin walls of the house, fragments of phrases reached him, sounding distant and foreign. Like voices from another world where he didn't exist. "You left your glasses in my car." His mother's voice was playful, full of lightness and relaxation, as if they were in a world where Ethan and his younger sister Lily didn't matter at all. Her words sounded as if she were completely absorbed in this moment, in this new connection that meant more to her than anything else. "Oh, it's no big deal. I can get by without them," the man replied, his voice deep and steady, with a note of confidence that seemed genuine. He spoke as if everything was fine, as if nothing could disrupt this illusion of peace and harmony. "By the way, I'm glad we went out tonight. It was a wonderful evening." "Yes, Tom, it was lovely. I haven't felt this good in a long time." Catherine's laughter rang out again, and the sound, like tiny shards of glass, scattered across Ethan's room, causing him a pain he couldn't put into words. The name Tom sounded in Ethan's ears like something alien, hostile, like a scream tearing through the silence. Another Tom. Another man thought he could enter their lives and pretend to be part of their family, while to Ethan, he was just a stranger. Every new man who appeared in his mother's life only deepened this feeling of estrangement, reinforcing his sense that he and his sister were merely part of a past his mother was trying to forget. Ethan felt the tension in his body grow as if some dark force had taken hold of his mind. He returned to his bed, his steps slow and heavy, as if each step echoed in his head. He sat on the edge of the bed, leaning back against the cold, rough wall, which seemed almost alive, breathing cold and loneliness. His eyes were wide open, but he saw nothing around him. His thoughts were chaotic, like a whirlwind that couldn't be stopped. Questions he didn't want to ask, answers he feared, all filled his mind like a poisonous fog, leaving no room for peace. Tom and Catherine went upstairs, and their footsteps faded somewhere above, in another part of the house. The sounds of their voices grew quieter, and soon they were barely audible. But Ethan still sat in the darkness, listening to every sound, every word spoken beyond the wall. He felt trapped, with no way out, as if he were locked in his room, unable to do anything but listen and suffer. Dark, oppressive thoughts slowly formed in his mind, thoughts he couldn't shake, and a growing desire that his mother would finally notice him, see that he was there, that he existed, and that he was hurting. Morning came too quickly, as if the night had flown by, leaving behind only exhaustion and a mind still unrested. Barely awake, Ethan felt a strange heaviness in his body, as if the night had failed to bring him the much-needed rest he longed for. The sun, already high in the sky, shone brightly, but its light brought no joy or warmth, only emphasizing the contrast between the outer world and Ethan's inner state. Sunbeams streamed through the curtains, filling the room with a cold light that was more irritating than uplifting. With a familiar, almost automatic motion, as if programmed to repeat simple tasks, Ethan dressed. He didn't think about what to wear, paying no attention to how it would look. Then, with slumped shoulders and a weary gaze, he descended the creaky stairs to the kitchen. There, the familiar smell of freshly brewed coffee and toasted bread hung in the air, a scent that usually evoked the comfort of a morning but today felt foreign and distant. On the kitchen table, breakfast plates were already laid out, arranged neatly but with a sense of haste. Ethan immediately noticed that one of them was meant for him, toast with scrambled eggs, his favorite dish, which once pleased him. But now, looking at the plate, he saw that it was placed at the very edge of the table as if it had been set down last minute, hastily and without thought. As if someone wanted to fulfill a duty but hadn't put any care into it. Taking his breakfast, Ethan sat at the table, trying to take up as little space as possible and avoid drawing attention to himself. He tried not to look at his mother and Tom, who sat nearby, engrossed in a conversation that seemed to be more important to them than anything else in the world. Catherine looked carefree and relaxed, her face illuminated by a light smile as if the previous evening hadn't left the slightest trace of fatigue on her. She chatted and laughed with Tom, who seemed as at ease in her company as she was. For them, this morning was a normal, peaceful time, just another happy moment in a series of such serene days. But not for Ethan. "You forgot your glasses yesterday, darling. We need to stop by after work to get them," Catherine said, her voice full of warmth and care, emotions she had so rarely shown lately. Her hand, gently resting on Tom's shoulder, seemed to speak of something more than just forgotten glasses. It was as if she were trying to create a bond, to build a connection with this new man, which made Ethan's presence feel even more insignificant. "Sure, I'll be right on it," Tom replied, his voice calm and friendly, with no hint of awkwardness or unease. His smile was relaxed, as if he belonged here, in this house, at this table, next to Catherine. As if he had always been here. Ethan remained silent, not even attempting to join the conversation or draw their attention. He looked at the food on his plate, which suddenly seemed tasteless and bland. He couldn't force himself to eat, as if his body rejected the idea of ingesting anything. Every time he glanced up, he saw the two of them laughing and chatting. Exchanging glances full of mutual understanding, completely oblivious to his presence. Their world seemed closed off to him, as if he were a stranger in his own home, someone who wasn't supposed to be here. His sister, Lily, arrived shortly after, her footsteps light and carefree. She was still in her pajamas, her hair messy, a sign of the carefree childhood she still enjoyed. With her small face glowing with innocence, she sat at the table, not noticing the tension hanging in the air. Her eyes lit up as she saw the scrambled eggs, and without hesitation, she began eating, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Morning, sleepyhead," Catherine greeted her daughter with the same warmth and love she had shown Tom. She kissed her lightly on the head, smoothing her tousled hair, and then turned back to Tom, continuing their conversation, as if they were the only two people in the world. "Morning, Mom," Lily replied cheerfully, her small, delicate voice filling the kitchen with life. She didn't seem to notice anything strange or out of place, her attention focused solely on her breakfast. Ethan watched this scene in silence, his heart heavy. A wave of bitterness washed over him, a familiar, unpleasant feeling that had become a constant companion in recent months. He felt as if he were standing on the edge of this life, observing it from a distance, unable to influence or change anything. The love and care that had once been directed toward him now seemed reserved for others, leaving him in the cold shadows of neglect. He stood up abruptly, leaving the half-eaten breakfast behind, and walked out of the kitchen without saying a word. The sound of his footsteps faded quickly as he retreated upstairs, seeking refuge in his room, the only place where he could find some semblance of peace. He knew that, for now, nothing would change, and this new man, Tom, would soon disappear like all the others. But the pain of being unseen, unnoticed, and unloved would remain. A constant reminder of the distance between him and his mother, a distance that grew wider with every passing day. Ethan walked down the street, lost in his thoughts as if everything around him had lost its meaning and significance. The world seemed to slip past him, and he moved mechanically, almost without realizing what was happening around him. The passers-by, hurrying to work or their errands, appeared to him as mere blurred silhouettes, faceless figures rushing by. The cars roaring down the road went unnoticed, their noise merging into a single hum that never reached Ethan's consciousness. He walked forward, mechanically stepping over the cracks in the pavement, but never once lifted his head to look around. The school he was approaching seemed to him not just a building but a massive, oppressive entity that weighed down on him with its grim, gray facade and gloomy, unfriendly windows. These windows seemed to stare at him with cold indifference, like the eyes of some monster hidden behind the concrete walls. The school was not a place where Ethan could find support or comfort. On the contrary, every day spent there reminded him of how lonely and alien he felt in this world. Its corridors, filled with students, were like a labyrinth to him, with no way out. Inside the school, as usual, there was a bustle. The students chatting carelessly in the hallways seemed alien to him, their cheerful voices sounding distant, incomprehensible, and meaningless. They rushed to their lockers, opening them with ease and agility. Familiar to those who feel confident in this place. They discussed homework, upcoming events, and plans for the evening, as if all these things mattered, as if they were important. But to Ethan, it all seemed like pointless noise, useless chatter, devoid of any substance or meaning. He entered the building, trying to stay in the shadows as if hiding from the gaze of others. Every step he took was calculated to remain unnoticed, to avoid any unnecessary encounters, conversations, or questions. He felt like an outsider here, as if his presence was a mistake, as if he had accidentally ended up in a place where he didn't belong. The smiles exchanged by other students seemed fake to him, like masks hiding their true faces. And the classes, which were supposed to fill his day with meaning and knowledge, felt like a waste of time, a routine that offered him nothing. When the bell rang, calling the students to the start of the lesson, Ethan slowly headed to his classroom. Here, in this room. Every corner was familiar to him, every spot reminded him of days gone by, but it brought him no comfort. He sat in his usual place, by the window, at the very back of the classroom, where he could remain unnoticed by the others. The sunlight streaming through the glass barely touched his face, as if the rays were avoiding him too. Ethan pulled a notebook and a pen from his backpack, but instead of writing anything down, he just stared at the blank pages. They, like his thoughts, remained empty, as if there was nothing worth recording. His mind wandered far away, distant from the reality where he physically existed. Mr. Randolph, the history teacher, was an experienced educator. He had worked at this school for many years and had seen it all. He knew his students, their habits and moods, and often noticed even the smallest changes in their behavior. Today, his gaze repeatedly stopped on Ethan, and he noted with concern his indifference and detachment. This wasn't the first time, and Mr. Randolph understood that it was time to intervene. After the lesson began, and the students were absorbed in their notebooks and textbooks, he decided he could no longer stand by. Approaching Ethan, Mr. Randolph stopped by his desk, his shadow falling over the table, blocking out the sunlight. He crossed his arms over his chest, his expression stern but not unkind. He knew that he needed to be firm but not harsh, as the boy was going through something. "Ethan," he began in a quiet yet firm voice, drawing the attention of not only Ethan but also a few other students who looked up from their work. "You didn't turn in your homework again. This isn't the first time. If this continues, I'll have to call your mother." The teacher's words landed like a hammer blow, but Ethan barely reacted. He slowly lifted his head, his gaze fixed on the blank page before him. It seemed as though he couldn't hear or understand what the teacher was saying. Then, almost without opening his mouth, he quietly muttered under his breath, "As if she cares." His words were so quiet that Mr. Randolph barely caught them. The teacher frowned, trying to catch the meaning of what was said, but couldn't make it out. Nevertheless, he understood that it wasn't just a phrase, but a reflection of some deep feeling hidden within Ethan. The tone of his voice and the lack of any reaction spoke volumes. Ethan appeared detached, as if there was an invisible barrier between him and the rest of the world, preventing him from fully being here and now. Feeling helpless, not knowing how to reach this boy who seemed so withdrawn and inaccessible, Mr. Randolph sighed and backed off. He returned to the board, deciding to leave Ethan alone, at least for this lesson. The classroom buzzed again with the voices of other students discussing the lesson's topic, but Ethan heard none of it. His thoughts were far away, beyond this space and time, where there was no school, no homework, no parents, and no responsibilities. He existed in his world, where everything was different, but that world was as empty and cold as the pages of his notebook. When the bell rang at the end of the lesson, the shrill sound suddenly brought Ethan back to reality. It was a sharp, unpleasant signal that seemed to cut through the silence in his head. He slowly packed his things, not hurrying, as if trying to delay the moment when he would have to leave. Then, like a shadow, he headed for the exit, trying to blend back into the crowd, to become invisible. To disappear. The school had long ceased to be a place where he could feel comfortable. It was just another stage to be endured, without stopping, without looking back. After school, Ethan returned home, feeling as though the entire world was pressing down on his shoulders. The house, which once might have been a refuge, now felt as foreign and cold as everything else around him. He slowly climbed the stairs, trying not to draw attention to himself, as if any interaction with his mother or sister might shatter the fragile shell he was trying to wrap himself in. As he passed by the kitchen, where Catherine was cooking something, the smell of food slightly touched him, but it didn't stir any appetite. He glanced briefly at his mother, who seemed not to notice his presence, absorbed in her tasks. Her face was focused but calm, like someone immersed in routine concerns. Ethan felt like he was just a faint silhouette in the background of her daily worries, no more than a shadow flickering on the periphery of her perception. He didn't linger and silently walked past, leaving her in that world that seemed so distant and inaccessible to him. On his way to his room, he heard Lily, his younger sister, humming some tune that floated from her room. It was a quiet, joyful melody, free of the worries and anxieties that filled his own heart. Lily was probably busy with her toys or drawing, immersed in a world full of bright and carefree fantasies. But Ethan didn't care. He didn't want to interact with her, didn't want to engage in her happiness, which seemed completely foreign to him. All he wanted was to lock himself in his room and immerse himself in the world that, at least for a while, gave him a sense of peace and safety. Closing the door to his room and drawing the heavy curtains, Ethan created almost complete darkness. The room became a closed, nearly isolated world, with no place for daylight or outside concerns. Only the light from the computer screen cut through the darkness, filling the space with cold, bluish light. This lighting was dim and sterile, but it matched the state Ethan was in. He quickly turned on the computer, his hands moving instinctively over the keys to find the file that could bring him temporary relief. This film was something special to Ethan, something he watched over and over again, escaping reality into dark scenes and a tense atmosphere. He didn't seek entertainment or relaxation in these films, rather, he sought something that resonated with his own experiences, reflecting the inner chaos and turmoil. The grim scenes of violence, bloody confrontations, and brutal retribution that filled these films seemed to cleanse his soul, allowing him to forget, for a time, what troubled him in real life. As the film began to load, Ethan sat on his bed, tucking his legs under him and placing the laptop in front of him. As soon as the first sounds of the film began, the room was filled with a new mood, detached from the outside world. These sounds drowned out everything around him, creating the sensation that he was in some other dimension where there was no place for his worries and fears. On the screen, scenes of brutality unfolded, each one carefully crafted as if the director was deliberately squeezing every emotion out of the viewer, forcing them to feel the depth of the violence. The main characters of the film, dark, embittered, obsessed with the idea of revenge, seemed close to Ethan, almost kindred spirits. Their ruthless actions and uncompromising nature evoked in him a strange sense of understanding and even some respect. These characters were ones he could understand, in whom he found a reflection of his hidden thoughts and emotions. Ethan couldn't take his eyes off the screen, as if afraid to miss something important, something that could provide answers to the questions that had been tormenting him for so long. As the film progressed, each scene drew him deeper into its dark, oppressive atmosphere. Ethan watched with bated breath, absorbed in the unfolding violence, the tension building in every frame. The characters, ruthless and driven by a desire for vengeance, fascinated him. He saw in them an embodiment of his frustrations and anger, emotions that had no outlet in his real life. In this world of cinema, where pain and violence reigned, he found a reflection of his internal storm, a connection that was both unsettling and somehow comforting. The bloodshed, the brutal confrontations, the relentless pursuit of justice through violence, these were not just scenes to Ethan. They were like a window into his soul, a place where he could temporarily release the pent-up anger and confusion that gnawed at him. With each fight, each act of vengeance, he felt as though a part of his pain was being released, momentarily easing the burden he carried. But the relief was always fleeting. As the credits rolled and the film came to an end, the weight of reality began to return. The darkness that had momentarily lifted came crashing back down on him, heavier than before. He closed the laptop slowly, staring blankly at the now dark screen, as if hoping that the movie's world could somehow remain, keeping him safe from the harshness of his reality. The room around him felt stifling, the air thick with silence. The darkness he'd sought for comfort now seemed suffocating, but Ethan didn't move to open the curtains or turn on the lights. He remained seated on his bed, lost in thought, replaying scenes from the film in his mind. The violence, the chaos, it all mirrored the storm inside him, a storm he didn't know how to calm. He often wondered why these films captivated him so much, why he found solace in their brutality. Maybe it was because, in these fictional worlds, the characters had the power to fight back, to take control of their lives through sheer force, while he felt powerless on his own. Or maybe it was because, in these dark stories, there was a sense of justice, however twisted, a justice he felt was absent from his own life. Ethan didn't have the answers, but he didn't need them. For now, it was enough to lose himself in these films, to escape into their violent fantasies, even if only for a while. It was his way of coping. His way of surviving the emptiness he felt every day. The sound of footsteps in the hallway snapped him back to reality. He quickly shoved the laptop aside and lay down on the bed, pulling the blanket over his head, pretending to be asleep. The door creaked open slightly, and for a moment, he could sense his mother standing there, watching him. She didn't say anything, and after a few seconds, the door closed quietly. Ethan waited until he heard her footsteps retreat down the hall before pulling the blanket down and staring at the ceiling. His heart ached with a longing he couldn't quite explain. He wanted something, comfort, understanding, connection, but he didn't know how to ask for it, didn't know how to reach out. The darkness of the room seemed to close in on him again, and he sighed deeply, turning over on his side, trying to push away the thoughts swirling in his mind. Tomorrow would be another day to get through, to endure. And maybe, just maybe, he would find solace again in the world of dark films, where everything made sense in a way that real life never did. Ethan sat on the floor of his room, surrounded by a chaotic mess of scattered books, notebooks, and notes. Everything lay around him, creating a disorder that seemed to mirror his inner state. To him, this mess had long ceased to be something that needed fixing. It was just part of his world, as ordinary as the thoughts that wouldn't leave him alone. These thoughts swirled in his mind like a swarm of annoying flies, preventing him from focusing. He tried to distract himself by flipping through a notebook, but couldn't concentrate on the text. Inside him, fragments of scenes from the movie he had watched earlier churned, dark, unsettling images that wouldn't leave him in peace. At that moment, the door to his room creaked slightly open. Ethan didn't notice at first, but soon a face peeked through the crack. It was Lily, his younger sister. Her face beamed with joy, her cheeks flushed from recent exercise. There was a sparkle of energy in her eyes, a brightness that seemed out of place in the dark, half-lit room. Lily had just returned from gymnastics practice, full of life and vigor. "Ethan," Lily cheerfully exclaimed, throwing the door open wider and bursting into the room like a ray of sunshine on a gray day. Her voice was joyful and carefree, as if she were certain her brother would share her good mood. She didn't notice his tension, or perhaps she didn't give it much thought, used to seeing him as the older brother she could always turn to. "I'm back from practice. You should have seen how I nailed that new routine. It finally worked." Ethan glanced at his sister briefly, but his eyes were empty, devoid of any interest or happiness for her achievements. He quickly turned away, continuing to flip through the pages of the notebook, pretending to be engrossed in something important. He tried to ignore her presence, not wanting her to see him as he was now. Her joy and energy seemed so far removed from his internal world that he felt they could never be reconciled. Lily, either not noticing or choosing to ignore his detachment, came closer and sat down beside him, placing her gym bag on the floor. "Why are you always sitting in your room?" she asked, a hint of concern in her voice. She didn't understand what was happening to her brother, why he had distanced himself from her. "Don't you want to play with me? We haven't done anything together in so long." For a moment, Ethan froze, feeling irritation rise within him. He didn't want to be rude to Lily. He understood she just wanted to spend time with him like they used to. But her happiness and carefree attitude only deepened his inner discomfort, making everything around him even more unbearable. Everything about her seemed too bright, too alive, too foreign. She didn't understand him, and he didn't want her to try. That only increased his sense of isolation. "Leave me alone, Lily," he said coldly, without lifting his gaze from the papers. His voice was dry and emotionless, as if he were speaking to a stranger, not his sister. He knew his words would hurt her, but he couldn't bring himself to say anything else. All he wanted was for her to leave and let him be. Lily froze, her smile slowly fading. Her usual cheerfulness vanished, replaced by confusion and hurt. She wasn't used to this tone from Ethan. Her brother had always been the one who supported and protected her. His coldness stunned her, leaving her bewildered. The confidence she always had in Ethan's love and understanding suddenly cracked. "But, Ethan," she began again, but her voice was no longer so sure. Her eyes filled with tears, though she tried to hold them back. She wanted to ask what was bothering him, but the words stuck in her throat. Lily could sense that something was deeply wrong, but she didn't know how to express it, or how to help him. "I said, leave me alone," Ethan repeated, this time looking up at her with eyes as empty as his voice. His gaze was cold, devoid of the warmth and care that used to be there. That cold, distant look was the final blow for Lily. She realized that talking to him now was pointless, that he was pushing her away, unwilling to share whatever he was going through. "Okay," she whispered, gripping the straps of her bag as if seeking support from them. Lily slowly rose to her feet and took a step back, as if an invisible force had pushed her away. She felt unnecessary and alone, as though she had suddenly found herself in a place where there was no room for her joy or love. Lily quietly left the room, her steps barely audible, as if she didn't want her departure to disturb her brother. Her heart ached with confusion and pain. But she didn't cry. She knew that tears wouldn't change anything. Lily just didn't understand what was happening, but one thing was clear: her brother had changed, and that scared her most of all. When the door closed again, Ethan shut his eyes and took a deep breath. In the silence of the room, he was alone once more, but now that loneliness didn't bring him relief. Instead, it deepened his sense of disconnection from everything around him. He knew that his cold indifference had only worsened things, adding another crack to his relationship with Lily. But he couldn't change anything. It felt like no one, not even those closest to him, could understand him, and that only made everything worse. On the other side of the door, Lily stood motionless, her thoughts swirling, her heart racing. She couldn't understand what had caused her brother to change so much, why he had pushed her away. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she held them back, refusing to cry. She knew she had to be strong. But that didn't lessen her pain. Lily felt like she was losing her brother, and that feeling was so overwhelming, she didn't know how to cope with it. The school was becoming more and more like a prison for Ethan, with each day feeling monotonous and suffocating. But today brought an unpleasant surprise. As soon as the bell rang for the third period, Mr. Randolph approached him. "Ethan, after class, you need to see Miss Wilson," the teacher said in a lowered voice. His face was serious, which immediately put Ethan on edge. Ethan nodded, though inside he felt a wave of anxiety. Miss Wilson was the school psychologist, and the very fact that he was being sent to her irritated him. He didn't want to explain what was going on to anyone, let alone hear the usual phrases about how important it was to express his feelings. After class, Ethan reluctantly headed toward the psychologist's office. He walked slowly, trying to drag out the time, but soon found himself standing in front of the door with the sign, "Miss Wilson." With a sigh, he knocked and entered. Miss Wilson greeted him with a smile, but there was a hint of caution in her eyes. She was a woman in her mid-30s, with soft features and a watchful gaze. Her office was cozy, posters with inspiring quotes hung on the walls, and shelves were lined with toys and books meant to help children relax. "Hello, Ethan," she said, inviting him to sit on the soft chair opposite her desk. "I'm glad you could make time to come. How are you feeling?" Ethan sat down, reluctantly meeting her gaze. He felt uncomfortable in this small room, where every detail seemed designed to make him feel safe and open. "Fine," he answered curtly, avoiding her eyes. Miss Wilson nodded and smiled slightly as if trying to put him at ease. "I've noticed you've been more withdrawn lately. You don't interact much with your classmates and often miss assignments. Is something bothering you?" Ethan glanced at her, knowing she was expecting some sort of response. He didn't want to delve into his thoughts. He didn't want anyone prying into his mind. He quickly thought about what he could say to get Miss Wilson to leave him alone. "Everything's fine," he said, trying to sound convincing. "I've just been thinking a lot." The psychologist observed him, her expression showing no dissatisfaction, but her eyes conveyed that she understood Ethan wasn't being honest. "What have you been thinking about, Ethan?" she asked gently, making sure not to pressure him. "Sometimes it can help to share your thoughts, especially if they're heavy." Ethan clenched his hands into fists, fighting the urge to withdraw even more. He already regretted agreeing to come here. It seemed to him that Miss Wilson was just doing her job and didn't understand what was going on inside his head. "It doesn't matter," he replied, a bit more harshly than he intended. I'll handle it myself." Miss Wilson smiled again, this time with a touch of sadness. She understood that Ethan wasn't ready to open up and that his withdrawal was a form of self-defense. But she wasn't ready to give up just yet. "I'm here to help if you need it," she said, studying his face carefully. "You can come to me anytime if you feel like talking, okay?" Ethan just nodded, eager to leave the office as soon as possible. It felt like everything in this room was pressing down on him, making him feel inadequate. "Can I go now?" he asked, barely hiding his irritation. Miss Wilson looked at him with a little sadness but nodded. "Of course, Ethan. If anything changes, you know where to find me." Ethan stood up and quickly left the office, closing the door behind him. Once in the hallway, he felt it was easier to breathe, but the sense of frustration and detachment didn't go away. This conversation had only strengthened his desire to keep his distance from everyone and be alone with his thoughts. He slowly headed to his next class, barely thinking about what had just happened. All that mattered to him was getting home as soon as possible, where no one would bother him. And where he could once again retreat into the world of his dark thoughts. The evening was quiet but tense. Ethan sat in his room, staring at his laptop screen, but his thoughts were far from the movie he was trying to watch. Inside, everything was boiling. A mix of irritation, anger, and frustration overwhelmed him. It felt like no one around him understood him, and his withdrawal only seemed to push people away even more. What infuriated him the most was Tom's presence in their home, as if he was trying to take a place Ethan wanted to remain empty. The noise from the kitchen distracted him from his thoughts. He heard Catherine and Tom talking and laughing while preparing dinner. Their happy voices irritated Ethan more than ever. He felt anger rising within him, and before he could stop himself, he stood up and left his room. He went down the stairs and headed to the kitchen. Catherine and Tom were sitting at the table, discussing something between themselves, but as soon as Ethan entered, Tom noticed him. "Hey, Ethan." Tom greeted him with a friendly smile. He looked a bit nervous but was trying to act as pleasant as possible. "How's it going? How's school?" Ethan stared at him, feeling the anger growing inside. He didn't want to respond, didn't want to talk to him at all. Tom noticed the cold look in Ethan's eyes and seemed a bit confused but still decided to continue the conversation. "You know, I heard you're into baseball," Tom went on, trying to make a connection. "How about we watch a game together? There's one on tonight. We could hang out." Ethan clenched his fists, his patience running out. He struggled to hold back his irritation, but suddenly everything spilled out. "You're not my dad," Ethan snapped, abruptly cutting Tom off. His voice was filled with rage. "Don't pretend you care. I don't give a damn about what you want or think." Tom froze, stunned by the outburst of anger. He tried to say something but didn't know how to respond to such hostility. The room fell into a heavy silence. Catherine, hearing her son's outburst, turned to him, her face filled with concern and surprise. She hadn't expected such behavior from Ethan, and his words seemed to deeply hurt her. "Ethan," she said sternly, standing up from her chair. "That was completely uncalled for. Tom is just trying to be kind and caring." Caring? Ethan couldn't believe what he was hearing. He felt a surge of bitterness and disappointment welling up inside him. "You call this caring? You don't even notice what's happening around you." Catherine looked taken aback for a moment but quickly regained her composure. "I won't let you talk to Tom like that. He's here to help us, and you need to understand that." Ethan stared at her in disbelief and anger, unable to believe she had taken Tom's side. He felt betrayed, and it only deepened his hatred. "You're choosing him over me," he muttered, his voice low but filled with spite, feeling his heart clench in pain. He turned and, without waiting for a response, stormed out of the kitchen. Slamming the door behind him, he rushed back to his room and slammed the door shut, feeling the anger bubbling up inside him. He couldn't believe his mother had taken Tom's side, that she hadn't even tried to understand him. His thoughts swirled in a chaotic mess, and he felt himself drifting further away from the world that had once felt like home. In the silence of his room, Ethan was left alone with his thoughts. An emptiness filled his heart, which was gradually consumed by darkness. After the conflict with Tom and Catherine, Ethan felt empty. He no longer felt like he belonged to this house, to this world. His anger and frustration continued to rage inside, but now he knew he couldn't share these feelings with anyone. His mother no longer seemed like someone he could trust, and Tom was a stranger who would never understand him. The only place where he could express his emotions was the virtual world, filled with violence and revenge. When Ethan returned to his room, he closed the door and sat back down at his computer. The desk was cluttered with textbooks and notebooks, but he no longer cared. The only thing that mattered was the games. They had become his refuge, his way to escape the reality where he felt weak and helpless. Ethan put on his headphones, launched one of his favorite games, and completely immersed himself in the digital world. This game was his perfect hiding place, a world where everything was simple, where skill and strength determined everything. In the virtual universe, he was a hero, delivering justice, punishing his enemies, and feeling satisfied by it. He could do things there that he couldn't allow himself in real life. The game began with a bright scene where Ethan's character was fighting enemies in a destroyed city. The screen lit up with explosions, and the sound of gunfire filled his headphones. Everything around him disappeared, Only the game remained, only these moments when Ethan could unleash his emotions. "Yeah, take that," he shouted as his character took down another enemy. His voice was filled with rage and glee, but in reality, it wasn't just a game. It was his way of expressing how he felt toward the world he believed had betrayed him. "That's what you deserve." Each keystroke, every shot, every defeated enemy brought him fleeting satisfaction. He felt the anger dissipating, replaced by a semblance of calm. But it was a deceptive feeling. Deep down, Ethan knew this wasn't a real solution to his problems. Just a temporary respite. Ethan started recording his gaming sessions, imagining himself not just as a player but as the hero of his movie. He envisioned his character avenging all the wrongs he had suffered in real life. In his mind, the game had become more than just entertainment. It was his way of dealing with what was happening in his life. "Watch this," he muttered to himself as his character won another mission. Ethan proudly watched the recording of his game, as if it were proof of his strength. His control over the situation. He felt that here, in the virtual world, he could be someone he couldn't be in reality, a person capable of changing his fate. Games consumed all his time, and he gradually delved deeper into them. He began to find satisfaction in virtual revenge, imagining what he could do in real life if he had the same power. These thoughts crossed his mind more and more often, and while Ethan understood that they were just fantasies, they gave him a sense of control that he so desperately lacked in real life. Days passed like this, and every morning he woke up with one thought: to quickly return to the game, to once again feel strong and independent. But even this virtual world couldn't drown out the pain and loneliness that continued to gnaw at him from the inside. Ethan knew that this reality was only a temporary refuge, and sooner or later, he would have to face real life again, where his problems hadn't gone away. Late night enveloped the city in silence. The house was steeped in darkness, with only the pale moonlight slipping through the curtains, casting a faint glow on the figure of a teenager sitting at his desk. Around him lay textbooks, notebooks, pens, and pencils, but none of them seemed important anymore. Ethan was focused on one thing: planning what had become his obsessive idea. His room was his sanctuary, a place where no one could disturb his thoughts. But with each passing minute, he realized more and more that virtual revenge in video games no longer satisfied him. These fantasies of power and control had begun to feel insufficient. He needed something more, something real. This thought began to dig deeper into his mind. Ethan picked up a notebook he usually used for school notes, but today it had become something else: an instrument to bring his dark intentions to life. He opened to a blank page and paused for a moment, contemplating where to begin. His thoughts raced from one idea to another until he finally settled on what seemed like the only right solution. Slowly, but confidently, he began to sketch a diagram. The first page displayed a simple layout of their house, with clearly marked rooms, doors, and windows. He drew everything with meticulous detail, as if it were not just a sketch, but a crucial part of his plan. He thought carefully about how and where traps could be set, and how to block escape routes. His hands moved mechanically as if someone else were guiding them. When the drawing was complete, Ethan looked it over and then grabbed a pen to jot down notes in the margins. He wrote short comments and ideas on how to execute his plan. Some of the notes were crude, others more detailed, but each was filled with the anger that churned inside him. He thought about how to scare his mother and Tom, how to make them feel the pain he felt. His notes grew darker with each passing thought. He devised ways to frighten them, to hurt them, to make them understand how deeply he hated them. Besides the layout of the house, he drew small symbols marking places for traps. In the living room, the kitchen, and near the stairs. He imagined how they might trigger, how to make them as terrifying and dangerous as possible. His thoughts became chaotic. Ethan crossed out some ideas and replaced them with others, more sinister and elaborate. He found pleasure in this process, in finally controlling something in his life, even if it was dark and destructive. It seemed to him that this plan was his way of screaming about his pain, without words, in a way that would finally make him heard. He made several sketches of the traps he intended to use, primitive devices crafted from everyday items around the house. He wrote lists of what he needed to prepare: ropes, knives, and locks. These notes resembled a grim script that he was preparing to turn into reality. Ethan worked on the notebook for hours, his attention to detail astonishing. He thought through every step, every possible outcome, trying to foresee everything. By the time he finished, the notebook was filled with drawings, diagrams, and notes, with each page bearing testimony to his growing obsession. Closing the notebook, Ethan felt a strange satisfaction. He glanced at the clock. It was already past midnight. But sleep would not come to him. His mind was still swarming with thoughts, plans, and ideas. He knew there was still much work ahead, but now, with a plan in place, he felt more confident. That night, Ethan once again sank into the darkness of his room, but this time, he was no longer the lost boy he once was. Now, he was determined to see his plan through to the end. This plan had become his new reality, and he was willing to do anything to bring it to life. The house was wrapped in silence, interrupted only by the faint rustling of pages and the soft scratching of a pencil. Ethan sat in his room, completely focused on his plan. His notebook lay open before him, where he was adding the final touches to his notes. He thought about how everything needed to unfold, mentally playing out every detail. His hands moved automatically, filling the notebook with new diagrams and notes. At that moment, he heard something strange, the light creak of the front door downstairs. That usually meant someone had come home. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He knew that Catherine and Tom were supposed to be at work and weren't expecting anyone until late evening. A thought flashed through his mind that it might be Lily, but he quickly dismissed it, focusing back on his notebook. However, that thought returned when he heard light footsteps in the hallway. They were getting closer to his room. Ethan froze. He quickly shut the notebook, tossed it into a desk drawer, and closed it just as the door to his room slowly opened. Lily stood in the doorway, her face lit by a slight smile, but concern was evident in her eyes. "Hey, Ethan," she said, cautiously stepping into the room. Her voice was soft, but the tension was unmistakable in her tone. "I called, but you didn't hear me. I came home early today. Practice was cancelled." Ethan turned sharply, his gaze full of irritation. "What are you doing here, Lily? Why aren't you at practice?" His voice was rough, almost hostile. He tried not to show how much her sudden appearance bothered him, but inside, he felt panic rising. Lily frowned slightly, noticing her brother's obvious displeasure. She glanced around the room, her eyes stopping at the desk where Ethan had hurriedly hidden his notes. "What were you hiding there?" she asked, pointing to the desk. Her voice was filled with curiosity but also tinged with worry. "Are you doing something I don't know about?" Her question felt like a dagger to Ethan's heart. He sensed he was losing control of the situation, and his irritation burst forth immediately. "Stay out of my business, Lily," he snapped, standing up from his chair and blocking the desk with his body. "This has nothing to do with you." Lily recoiled, her face twisting in surprise and hurt. She wasn't a stranger to her brother's bad moods, but this reaction was unexpected. "Ethan, what's wrong with you?" she asked, taking a step back. "You've never talked to me like this before." Ethan clenched his fists, trying not to show how much her presence unnerved him. He understood that if Lily found out what he was planning, everything could fall apart. He had to push her away, make her leave. "Just leave me alone," he said coldly, turning toward the window, avoiding eye contact. Shaken, Lily gave her brother one last look, then glanced at the closed desk drawer he was so fiercely guarding. She knew something wasn't right, but Ethan had made it clear she wasn't welcome to interfere. Biting her lip, her eyes welling up with tears, she didn't say another word. Silently, she turned and left the room, slowly closing the door behind her. Once Lily was gone, Ethan felt the tension gradually leave his body. He exhaled heavily and walked over to the door, listening to her footsteps until they faded down the stairs. He knew this was a close call, and that Lily could become a threat to his plan if she decided to investigate further. But now, he was more determined than ever to keep her from finding out. He returned to the desk and opened the drawer, retrieving the notebook. Its pages seemed to hold his darkest thoughts. But now, after the encounter with Lily, his fingers trembled slightly. Doubts flickered in his mind, but he quickly pushed them aside. His plan had to work. He couldn't afford to fail. Ethan dove back into his notes, trying to convince himself that Lily wouldn't get in his way. Yet her concerned look lingered in his mind, continuing to gnaw at his thoughts as he worked on his plan for revenge. The next morning began as usual. Ethan slowly rose from his bed, tired and irritated after a sleepless night. Thoughts about Lily still swirled in his mind, and an overwhelming sense of anxiety made him feel even more tense. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was spiraling out of control, like he was facing something he couldn't handle, and each day brought new reminders of his hopelessness. At around 11, he left his room and headed to the kitchen, hoping to grab a quick bite before immersing himself in his dark thoughts and plans again. In the kitchen, Catherine and Tom were already sitting, enjoying a peaceful breakfast. Their conversation was full of joy and plans, but Ethan didn't want to bother with the details. He just wanted to eat and retreat to his solitude. As soon as he entered the kitchen, Catherine and Tom started discussing something with noticeable excitement. Ethan caught a phrase from their conversation that instantly grabbed his attention. He stopped near the table, tilting his head, trying to listen without them noticing, but not wanting to miss a word. Catherine, smiling, suggested, "Maybe we could go to the mountains for the weekend? It would be great to spend time together. We could rent a small cabin, enjoy nature, just relax." Tom, enthusiastically supporting the idea, added, "That's a brilliant idea. A little getaway, with no worries or stress. I've always dreamed of spending a weekend outdoors." These words hit Ethan like a bolt of lightning. He stood motionless, gritting his teeth, trying to suppress the rage boiling inside him. Every moment spent at this table, and every detail of their conversation, felt like a stab to his heart. Not a single word about taking him along. It was as if he didn't even exist. Ethan felt his body tense with anger. This wasn't the first time they had overlooked him, but this time it was too much. He felt himself slipping into the abyss, and his patience snapped. Unable to bear it any longer, he abruptly turned and left the kitchen without saying a word. When he returned to his room, anger consumed his thoughts. He pulled out his notebook and started ripping out the pages filled with his previous plans. They now seemed too complicated, too far-fetched. He began searching for new ideas, more extreme and radical ones that would make Catherine and Tom finally pay attention to his suffering. Each tear of a page was accompanied by a muffled growl of frustration. He didn't know what to do or how to implement his ideas, but the feeling of being neglected and rejected was too strong to ignore. Ethan realized that his plan was escalating, but he couldn't stop. He needed to make his feelings visible and heard, and he was willing to go to any lengths to achieve that. Soon, the notebook was torn apart and scattered across the room, and Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, filled with determination and fury. All the emotions he had tried to suppress came rushing out, and now his thoughts were focused on finding a way to regain control and get the attention he so desperately craved. His anger and frustration had reached their peak, and now every moment spent in this house felt like it was drenched in hatred and betrayal. He knew his plan might not be perfect, but he was ready to risk everything for his revenge. New ideas swirled in his mind, new ways to retaliate, and he was ready to move forward without looking back. Once again, darkness enveloped the house, but for Ethan, the night only meant one thing: time for action. After his anger had reached its peak, he couldn't wait any longer. Now, he was ready to put a part of his long brewing plan into action. His goal was simple: to create a trap that could scare or even hurt Catherine and Tom, forcing them to finally acknowledge his pain. Ethan chose a small room on the second floor for his trap, a room that used to be a playroom but now sat empty and unused, making it the perfect place for his scheme. He started by gathering the necessary materials: strong ropes, an old bear trap he found in the basement, and a few other items that could be used to make it look like an accident. Kneeling on the floor, Ethan tore open an old box to retrieve the trap. His face was tense, his hands steady as he worked. Each movement was precise and calculated. He knew there was no room for error. First, he tested the trap to make sure it was still functional. He snapped it a few times, ensuring the mechanisms worked properly. Then, rubbing his hands together, he moved on to the next step. Ethan selected the spot for the trap carefully. He chose the center of the room as the most likely place where someone might step by accident. He carefully placed the trap on the floor, then covered it with several layers of paper and fabric scraps to conceal it from view. He arranged everything meticulously, making sure there were no visible signs that something was amiss. Next came the ropes. Ethan tied one end of a rope to the top of the door and the other to the trap's trigger. He made sure the rope was taut in such a way that it would pull when the door was opened, activating the trap. He planned it so that when the door swung open, the rope would pull tight and set off the trap. When everything was set, he made another round of the room, checking each detail. He ensured the trap was hidden and the rope was properly aligned. Every move he made was deliberate and confident. His attention to detail was unyielding because he knew that if anything went wrong, his plan could be exposed, and the consequences could be unpredictable. Ethan also thought of other elements to enhance the illusion of an accident. He spilled some water on the floor near where the trap was set to make it look like a slippery surface. Adding to the believability of the situation, he watched with satisfaction as the water spread, leaving a damp spot that could easily be mistaken for a spilled drink. Each step was meticulously planned. Ethan wanted everything to appear as though it had happened by chance, not as part of a deliberate trap. He believed that if everything looked convincing enough, no one would suspect him. When the work was done, Ethan felt both satisfied and excited. He knew the trap was set, and now he only had to wait for someone to fall into it. He felt as if he had finally achieved what he wanted, to be seen and heard. And even though a flicker of fear sometimes crept into his mind, he knew he had done everything he could. Ethan stood, looked over his work one last time, and, pleased with the result, quietly left the room. He left the trap behind, trying not to think about the possible consequences. Now, all that remained was to wait and watch as his plan began to unfold. Soon after Ethan set up the trap, the days became filled with anxiety and waiting. He tried to keep himself occupied, but the thought that someone might accidentally stumble into his trap tormented him. He didn't know when someone might come home and possibly encounter the snare he had prepared. One afternoon, as Ethan sat quietly in his room, lost in dark thoughts, he heard the creak of the door on the stairs. It was an unexpected sound because, according to his plan, Lily was supposed to return home later. At first, he thought it might be a mistake, but his fear became a reality when he heard light footsteps approaching the hallway. Ethan jumped off the bed and rushed into the corridor. There he saw Lily, who had just returned home. She was still in her gymnastics uniform, with a backpack slung over her shoulder. Her face lit up with the joy of coming home, but as soon as she noticed Ethan, she immediately sensed something was wrong. Lily stopped, looking at her brother in surprise. "Ethan, what are you doing here? Why aren't you sleeping?" she asked, her voice full of curiosity and concern. Seeing her approach, Ethan's heart raced. He saw Lily heading toward the room where he had set the trap, and panic overtook him. He realized that there was now a real danger and that she could unknowingly be in harm's way. "Lily, go to your room. Right now," Ethan commanded abruptly, trying to keep his voice calm, but panic was evident in his tone. He stepped forward, attempting to block her path, his eyes darting around the hallway as if searching for a way to prevent her from walking into the trap. Lily froze, her eyes widening in surprise. She didn't understand why Ethan was so insistent that she leave, and her concern only grew. She stood still, looking at him, eyebrows raised in confusion, unsure of what to do. Fear swelled within Ethan. Every word he spoke seemed inadequate to convey the seriousness of the situation. He was willing to do anything to prevent his sister from accidentally falling into the trap, but he didn't know how to handle it without revealing his intentions. Watching her confusion and fear, Ethan desperately hoped that Lily would obey his order and return to her room before she could see what he had prepared. One single thought raced through his mind: to stop anything bad from happening. Ethan felt the world around him collapsing. His mind raced as he saw Lily standing in the hallway, and he realized the terrible truth: she could become the victim of his trap. Suddenly, everything he had planned and prepared seemed horrifying and irreparable. His dreams of revenge, which once seemed so important, now turned into a living nightmare. His hands trembled, and panic rose inside him. He looked at Lily, who was still standing there, watching him with concern, and saw that she was getting closer to the door where the trap was set. He realized he had made a catastrophic mistake and that his sister might suffer because of his actions. Thoughts raced through Ethan's mind, but he couldn't express them coherently. He repeated to himself, though not aloud, "What have I done? This wasn't how it was supposed to end." This internal monologue became his cry of despair. He tried to understand how he had reached this point, how his plan, which was meant only as a means to attract attention, had turned into a real threat to his sister. Panic gripped his heart, and with trembling hands, he started thinking about how to fix the situation. His mind frantically searched for a way out, and every movement felt slow and difficult. He knew there wasn't enough time to undo his actions, and his fear only grew. Ethan rushed into the corridor where the trap was set, his eyes scanning the room for a way to disable the mechanism. Time was running out, and every moment Lily drew closer to the danger zone, the more alarming it became. Ethan's hands shook as he struggled to focus on the task. He quickly approached the trap and began trying to disable it. He grabbed the rope and attempted to untie it, but his fingers were trembling, making the task difficult. Every movement was unsure and frantic, and he felt the fear growing with each passing second. Every action felt like a struggle as he tried to undo the rope. But it only made things more difficult. He was sweating from the tension, and his efforts seemed futile. Ethan screamed in frustration as he saw Lily getting closer and closer to the room. His fear was real and overwhelming, and he didn't know how to stop everything he had set in motion. Lily was too close, and Ethan knew the time was almost up. All he could do now was hope for a miracle to prevent what he had caused. The moment Ethan realized what he had done, a wave of overwhelming panic consumed him. The psychological pain and fear became almost unbearable. His mind, filled with dread, made a snap decision to call the police, hoping it could prevent the impending disaster. With trembling hands, Ethan grabbed his phone and dialed 911. He was on the verge of breaking down, and his voice was barely audible through the nervous tremble. Every word he uttered felt heavy and difficult. The 911 operator answered with professional calm, trying to help and understand what had happened. 911, how can I assist you? She asked. Ethan, barely holding back tears and fear, tried to speak clearly, but his voice shook with terror. I did something terrible. I didn't mean for this to happen, he stammered, his words breaking and full of despair. The operator, maintaining her composure, began asking questions to figure out the details and understand the situation Ethan was in. Where are you? Are you safe? Is anyone hurt? She continued, determined to gather the necessary information. Ethan, still trembling, replied, No, not yet. Please, come quickly. His words were filled with a sense of hopelessness and urgency. He was in a panic and didn't know how to explain everything that had happened. Every second felt like an eternity, and he begged for help, realizing he had made a terrible mistake. The operator tried to calm him down and continued asking questions to gather as much information as possible to ensure a quick response. Ethan kept pleading for help, his fear and desperation evident in every word. He knew that his actions now had serious consequences, and he prayed that the police would arrive in time to undo what he had set in motion. Ethan stood by the window, his eyes wide with fear as he saw the police car approaching the house. The flashing lights and sirens blazed in the darkness, and he felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat. At that moment, he realized there was no turning back, that the situation had spiraled out of control, and his actions had led to real danger. Lily, still in the hallway, noticed the approaching police vehicles and turned to her brother with a worried expression. Ethan, what's going on? Why is the police here? She asked, her voice filled with uncertainty and fear. Ethan, on the verge of hysteria, tried to mask his despair, but his voice cracked. It doesn't matter, just stay here and don't move, he shouted, trying to sound confident, but his eyes betrayed his confusion. He knew that everything was now exposed, and no words could undo the catastrophe he had created. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, and he prayed that the police would arrive in time to prevent what he had done. He felt his fear engulfing his mind, hoping that everything would end without further consequences. The police arrived quickly. They forced the door open, shattering it as they stormed into the house, prepared for any situation. The sounds of their footsteps and commands echoed through the hallway, and Ethan, with trembling legs, ran to meet them. He felt panic constricting his movements, and his heart raced so fast he could barely breathe. One of the officers noticed Ethan and immediately approached him. His face was focused, and he was ready for any outcome. Everyone stay where you are. We're here to help. Where is the danger? The officer shouted, his voice clear and authoritative. Ethan, gritting his teeth in fear and shame, pointed towards the room where the trap was set. There. In the room, he said, his voice strained and filled with despair. He knew it was incredibly difficult, but he also knew he had to indicate the location of the trap so the police could act. The police quickly moved to the indicated area. One officer went to Lily to escort her to a safe place while the others continued to search the house. Lily, still stunned by what was happening, looked at Ethan with a mix of shock and fear, but the officer gently took her hand and led her to another part of the house, trying to calm her and ensure her safety. Ethan, watching the police, felt he would now have to face the consequences of his actions. The police quickly took control of the situation in the house. One of the officers, carefully inspecting the area Ethan had pointed out, found the trap hidden behind a door. With his experienced eye and careful movements, he began to dismantle the mechanism to disable it. The trap was a complex contraption, a tangle of ropes, springs, and metal parts. The officer commented on its danger with a hint of intrigue. "This thing is really dangerous," the officer said as he continued to carefully disassemble the trap. "If it had gone off, it could have seriously injured or even killed someone. We were lucky to have disabled it in time." Ethan, standing nearby and watching the officers, felt his fear and shame becoming almost unbearable. His lips barely moved as he whispered, "Yes. I didn't think it would go this far." His voice was filled with regret and internal devastation. He realized that his actions could have had tragic consequences, and now all he could do was worry about how it would affect his family. Once the trap was successfully disabled, the police proceeded to the next step, Ethan's arrest. With grim expressions on their faces, they put handcuffs on him, and Ethan felt his world completely crumble. Every click of the handcuffs and each step toward the exit became increasingly difficult for him. Torn between fear and deep regret, Ethan tried to plead for forgiveness. Tears streamed down his face as he sobbed, "Please, forgive me. I didn't mean for this to happen." His words were filled with despair and tears. Catherine, standing next to Lily, watched the scene with horror. Her face was contorted with pain and shock as she saw her son, once her pride, now being led out of the house in handcuffs. "What have you done, Ethan? How could you?" Her voice trembled, filled with both despair and anger. She could hardly believe that her son could do something like this, and now she had to face the consequences of his actions. Lily, standing beside her mother, was overwhelmed with fear and confusion. She couldn't comprehend how her brother could end up in such a situation, and her eyes were filled with tears and helplessness. The scene she was witnessing seemed utterly impossible, leaving an indelible mark on her mind. Ethan was brought to the police station, where he was placed in an interrogation room. The walls were lined with gray, and the bright lights made the environment even more oppressive. Two detectives, a man and a woman, sat at a table observing Ethan, who sat on a chair across from them. Shackled and surrounded by an uncomfortable silence. The male detective, a middle-aged man with a serious demeanor, began the questioning. "Ethan, what led you to make such a decision? You understand this was more than just a prank?" His voice was stern, yet it carried a note of genuine concern. Ethan, looking sad and exhausted, glanced at the detectives. His voice was weak and trembling as he replied, "I wanted them to notice me. To understand how much I was hurting." His words were full of despair. He tried to explain that his actions were a result of accumulated anger and pain from being ignored by his family. The detectives nodded, taking notes and trying to understand what could have led to such a serious act. They asked additional questions, trying to delve deeper into his motivations and determine how similar situations could be prevented in the future. The questions were probing but polite, as they aimed to understand the true reasons behind the tragic event. Catherine, looking exhausted and distressed, arrived at the police station to see her son. Her eyes were red from crying, and she could barely speak as she entered the cell where Ethan sat, shackled. The sight of Ethan in this setting was a devastating blow for her. Breaking down in tears, Catherine looked at Ethan and said, "Ethan, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you talk to me?" Her voice was filled with pain and regret. She finally saw her son's suffering and felt a deep guilt for her previous neglect. Ethan, also broken and exhausted, looked at his mother with a profound sense of estrangement. "I tried, but you were too busy to hear me." His voice was filled with despair, and he felt that all his attempts had been in vain. He didn't know how to explain his feelings and why he couldn't find another way to express his pain. Catherine tried to find words of comfort and understanding, but she realized it was now too late. Her heart ached knowing that she hadn't noticed or supported her son during his difficult time.